Alright, today I'm going to start going over the principles of the U.S. Constitution. So I know we went over it in class, but I want to go ahead and review it. So going to do a lot of review material and post things for you guys, okay? So the first principle we went over was popular sovereignty. What popular sovereignty is, it literally just means people rule, and we rule through voting. So the word popular, people, and then sovereignty, when you look at the word sovereignty, there's this word inside of it, reign. People in this nation rule, and how you and I rule is we rule through voting. So every single 2 years, we do voting every even years, we are out there voting, and there's lots of ways for us to vote, like lots of different elections. You've got primaries, caucuses, and you have the general elections. So the general elections are always in November, and they're every 2 years. Sometimes they're presidential election years, like we have in 2020. Then sometimes they're midterm election years called like 2018. Okay. So people in our country, we give our consent through voting. And so one of the big ways we can connect it to our Constitution is Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution. And the easiest way to kind of remember Article 5 is keep it alive. This is the article that talks about how we actually go through the amending process of our Constitution. So if we feel something needs to be changed in the Constitution, a formal change, we have a way to do it. We have a way of getting an amendment done. And remember in class we went over those amendments. We have 27 times we have had to use Article 5 to change our Constitution. The first, ones came very fast, the Bill of Rights, the first 10. But then as time went on, we've added 11 through 27. So we've done it a couple more times since the beginning. So every single 2 years, you have the opportunity to do popular sovereignty. But you can also do popular sovereignty through other things, like answering a public opinion poll. So a poll is a political survey. So when politicians are asking you for your opinion, that is you telling them how you want them to vote, how you want them to actually make those decisions for us. There's also other ways that we can do things. So sometimes we do direct votes on issues. So when you go and you vote, maybe this coming up year or this coming up election, November 2020, or in the next couple of years, you might be at the polls and voting. You could be voting directly on a law, so a potential law. All right, the next one of our principles is limited government. So all citizens, even the United States government officials, must follow the laws of the U.S. Constitution. No one, not even the government itself, is above the Constitution. So, you guys have lived through an example of this with the impeachment of President Trump. But remember, the term impeachment just means accused of wrongdoing. Now, it could be wrongdoing as a criminal act. So this would be like when some normal person gets accused of a crime, you've been indicted, charged with. So that's the same thing with impeachment. It's just a fancier term for the president. Or it could be a vice president. It can be anybody who works in the executive branch or anybody who works in our judicial branches, like our judges. So when impeachment goes on, the House of Representatives is going to start. They do the investigating. They're investigating, is there something really there? So that's kind of like what cops do. And then when cops feel like there's enough there, then they issue the charges. They recommend those charges to the prosecutor. So the U.S. House of Representatives, they collected all the evidence on Presidents Trump, Clinton, and this older president, Andrew Johnson. So this is after the Civil War. And they felt that there was enough evidence there, to go ahead and charge the president with impeachment. So once they start charging, then it's going to go over here to the opposite house of Congress, the Senate. And the United States Senate is actually going to do the court stuff. They're going to hold the trial, and they're going to act as jurors in a United States impeachment proceeding. Okay? So impeachment always begins in the House and it ends in the Senate. And that's just like an easy way to kind of remember it. Okay? So when government officials are in trouble, they can't say, because I'm the government, I get to do whatever I want. That's what dictators say. So we don't allow that in the United States government. Everyone has to follow the laws, even the President of the United States. The next principle that we're looking at is separation of powers. So in separation of powers, this is where our government decided to break up its jobs and its roles into 3 branches. And this is to make sure that no branch becomes too powerful. So we talked about this in Unit 1 when we talked about the Enlightenment and we talked about Montesquieu. So Montesquieu really felt that if you had 3 branches, that you would be able to make certain that you never had a dictator, you never had a government that was too powerful. So what the legislative branch does is that they make the laws. So they create them, they think them up, and that's all they do. So then they send it to the president or to the executive. And so when it gets here to the president, he gets to sign it into law. And what he does is enforces the law. But the president can't just go about enforcing all the law on his own. He has to have a lot of help. So, vice president, the cabinet, and any of the executive agencies. Executive agencies would be like the CDC, the Center for Disease Control. FEMA, our Federal Emergency Management Agency. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agencies. So they help the president and the executives enforce the laws that Congress has made. Then we have our judicial branch. And so the judicial branch is going to interpret the laws. They make certain that laws are fair and just and that they're being applied equally. So you have federal courts, and of course the top of the federal courts is the Supreme Court. So this diagram here, it shows you what Congress does and their responsibilities. It shows you what the president does and his responsibility or her responsibilities. And then it shows the courts, and it shows, like, we got at the top is our Supreme Court, Court of Appeals, and then we have our district courts. It tells you what they do. Now, this chart also gives us the next principle, the checks and balances and stuff. So all these little arrows reading in between them is how each of the branches does a check and a balance to each other. Because by having separate branches, we also have the checks and balances. And remember when I explained separation of powers, everybody has a job, everybody has a role, a responsibility, and if everybody stays in their lane, everything's fine. So each of the branches stays in their lane. I stay in my lane, you stay in yours, you stay in yours. And when they try and merge, like they're trying to get too powerful, we'll see how this branch, this thing won't allow it to happen. So the principle of the U.S. Constitution is there to protect us from, let's say, a president eliminating Congress or eliminating the courts. You can't do it. It's to make certain that Congress doesn't eliminate the president or eliminate the courts. It's not going to allow it. Same thing with the courts. So the branches are all there. They're all separate. They're distinct in what their job description is. And they're going to, in the next, one of our next principles is to ensure that they are doing what they're supposed to do. So in our next principle, we look at checks and balances. So each branch monitors the other branch. It's like a monitor, it is kind of self-regulating. So our government does a lot of limiting to its own power. And so we looked at that, like when we looked at the ex post facto laws, the Bill of Attainers, the writ of habeas corpus. our government has already a lot of limits built into it. And this is a principle that very much backs that. So each branch monitors the other. Like Congress, our legislative branch, they create bills and they pass those bills to the president. His role or her role as the chief law enforcer or the chief legislative leader is to go ahead and sign those bills into law. And now once they become law, it's the president's job to go ahead and enforce it. So when Congress gives him a bill, whatever the bill is, if he approves of it, he thinks that this is actually a really good bill, the executive can go ahead and sign it, and that is the president using their legislative power to do that. And then afterwards, they're going to use their executive power to enforce the law. Now, the president might not like the bill. Like, there are bills that come to the president's desk that they think is not true to what the American people want. Maybe they don't like the way it's written. It could be something that would be hard to enforce. It could just be something where it's got a lot of extra words that people might not understand. It also could have a lot of money attached to it. And so what the president can do is he can go ahead and veto it. So the president uses his power or her power to go ahead and strike out a law. So now what can happen is Congress can go ahead and override that veto. So Congress, the legislative, can now check the power of this executive branch and say, no, it's going to become a law anyway. There's another good example of checks and balances, like, for example, our executive gets to go about negotiating treaties. So they can negotiate treaties. That means they talk about it. They are going to foreign countries and they're making certain that this treaty is going to be what's best for us. Sometimes, though, when presidents negotiate treaties, the Senate doesn't like it. So he might have to work on the treaty and come up with something else. But the Senate has to approve the treaty. So our executive, our president, can't go signing us up for treaties unless the Senate approves it. And that's a check on his foreign negotiation powers. So like I'm giving you an example here with the New York Times. This was the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I. Well, the president thought it was great, President Wilson. The Senate thought it was horrible. And so even though we negotiated this treaty for the entire world, we do not sign it. So they refuse to approve it. So we have to make a different treaty, a different way to end the U.S. involvement in World War I. And I'm going to end this video here today. I'm going to look at federalism and flexibility next, the last two principles, in the next video segment.